The photograph was taken in the late summer of 1941, just before the valley disappeared. A wide river bends gently between wooded hills, calm and ordinary, the surface broken only by a narrow wooden bridge and a scattering of farmhouses along the banks. In the distance, a line of trees marks the edge of cultivated land, and behind them rises a steep ridge of limestone and shale. Nothing in the image suggests catastrophe. Nothing suggests urgency. Yet every structure in that frame, every fence post, every orchard, every dirt road, now rests beneath more than 100 feet of water. Today, that same location is known as the Lake of the Ozarks, one of the largest artificial reservoirs in the United States. The official explanation is straightforward. In the early 20th century, federal planners and engineers identified the Ozark region as an ideal site for hydroelectric development and flood control. Rivers were dammed, valleys were flooded, communities were relocated. Progress required sacrifice. The record shows contracts, surveys, and construction schedules. The language is technical, orderly, and confident. But when historians and surveyors began comparing older maps to modern shorelines, small inconsistencies appeared. Entire road networks were shown in early engineering diagrams, yet vanished from later publications. Town names listed in county tax ledgers did not appear in relocation summaries. In some cases, cemeteries were documented, then quietly omitted from final reservoir plans. These were not rumors or folklore. They were recorded features, measured and labeled in ink, then removed from the narrative as if they had never existed. There is another possibility, one that surfaces repeatedly in archival correspondence and engineering memoranda. Not that the valleys were flooded simply to produce electricity or control floods, but that certain landscapes within them contained structures and formations considered too large, too unusual, or too costly to remove individually. The water did not just generate power, it simplified the problem. It concealed the evidence, it stabilized the terrain, and closed the file. The first clues appear in the surveys themselves. In 1913, geological teams working along the Osage River documented a series of elevated stone embankments running parallel to the natural valley floor. These were not random rock piles. They formed continuous lines, sometimes extending for hundreds of yards, with slopes measured at consistent angles and bases reinforced by compacted gravel. The language used in the field notes is cautious. The structures are described as ancient terraces or unclassified earthworks. No definitive origin is assigned. Yet the measurements remain precise, and the diagrams show deliberate geometry rather than erosion. Local newspapers from the same period contain brief references to stone ridges uncovered during road grading and quarry expansion. Workers reported striking unusually hard masonry beneath shallow soil, often arranged in layered courses resembling retaining walls. In several cases, the material resisted standard blasting powder, forcing crews to reroute construction. These incidents were recorded, then forgotten, folded into routine infrastructure reports. But the pattern repeats. The stone remembers. A second line of evidence emerges from aerial photography conducted during the 1930s. Early reconnaissance flights over the Ozark valleys produced images that were later archived by the Army Corps of Engineers. When these photographs are examined closely, faint rectilinear outlines appear across floodplain surfaces, especially during dry seasons when vegetation thinned and shadows lengthened. The shapes resemble foundations or platforms, aligned along axes inconsistent with modern farming patterns. Some measure more than 200 feet in length. Others form clusters suggesting organized settlements or industrial complexes. The official captions describe them as agricultural features or erosion scars. The explanation feels convenient. It does not explain the symmetry. Then there are the bridges. Before the reservoirs were filled, engineers documented dozens of stone bridge abutments along tributary creeks feeding the main river channel. Most were assumed to be remnants of 19th century infrastructure. Yet several examples displayed construction methods associated with much older masonry traditions. Massive block foundations, carefully interlocked without visible mortar, anchored directly into bedrock. The scale alone raised questions. Some abutments exceeded 30 feet in height and were positioned in locations where no recorded roadways existed. What matters is not that these structures were unusual. What matters is that they were measured, photographed, and then omitted from final project summaries. To understand the context, it helps to examine the official rationale behind the dams themselves. By the early 20th century, seasonal flooding along the Osage and White Rivers had become a persistent economic concern. Agricultural losses were mounting, transportation routes were unreliable. Hydroelectric generation promised both stability and profit. Engineers proposed a series of large reservoirs designed to regulate water flow and support regional development. The plan was ambitious but not unprecedented. Similar projects were underway across the United States. The mainstream explanation holds that the flooding of the Ozark valleys was simply part of this national modernization effort. And in many respects, the evidence supports that view. Contracts were signed with private power companies, federal funds were allocated, thousands of workers were employed during construction. Entire communities were relocated through negotiated buyouts. The infrastructure functioned as intended. Electricity production increased, flood damage decreased. Economic growth followed. Yet, even within official documentation, small anomalies persist. In one engineering report dated 1929, surveyors noted encountering substantial stone formations inconsistent with mapped geology along the proposed reservoir boundary. The phrase appears only once, buried in an appendix. No follow-up analysis is recorded. The project continued without revision. Another report from 1931 references the need to accelerate land acquisition in specific zones identified as structurally complex. The language is technical but revealing. Rather than describing the terrain as unstable or hazardous, planners emphasized administrative urgency. Properties were purchased quickly. Demolition proceeded ahead of schedule. The record shows efficiency. It does not show explanation. Consider the timing. The largest reservoirs in the Ozark region were completed during a period of rapid institutional expansion, when federal agencies gained unprecedented authority to reshape landscapes in the name of public welfare. Environmental assessments were minimal. Historical preservation standards were still evolving. If an obstacle appeared during construction, the simplest solution was often to remove it, document it briefly, and move forward. This is not evidence of conspiracy. It is evidence of momentum. A third body of evidence comes from oral histories collected decades after the reservoirs were filled. Former residents described seeing stone structures emerge during drought conditions when water levels dropped dramatically. Foundations appeared along exposed shorelines, sometimes accompanied by staircases descending into mud or fragments of wall extending beneath the surface. These features were photographed by tourists and fishermen, then dismissed as remnants of abandoned farmhouses. But the scale of some exposures exceeded what a single homestead would require. Wide platforms, broad terraces, and unusually thick masonry suggest a different origin. One particularly detailed account comes from a retired engineer who worked on maintenance operations in the 1950s. He described encountering a submerged stone formation while inspecting spillway channels near the dam. The structure consisted of large rectangular blocks arranged in stepped layers, each precisely aligned and partially embedded in sediment. Divers measured the formation at nearly 80 feet across. The official logbook labeled it a natural outcrop. No geological analysis followed. What remains is the measurement. The pattern becomes more difficult to ignore when the focus shifts beyond a single reservoir. Across the Midwest and Appalachian regions, dozens of large dams were constructed during the same era. Many flooded valleys with long histories of settlement and infrastructure. In several cases, archival photographs show extensive stonework in areas later submerged by reservoirs. Retaining walls, terraces, and foundations appear repeatedly, often in landscapes where official histories describe sparse rural development. The pattern does not disappear. Maps provide another layer of evidence. Early 20th century topographic charts of the Ozark region display intricate networks of roads and property boundaries extending deep into valley floors. These maps were produced using precise surveying instruments and verified through repeated measurements. Yet when later editions were published after reservoir construction, many of these features were simplified or removed entirely. Shorelines replaced roads. Blank water surfaces replaced detailed terrain. Cartographers explain the changes as routine updates reflecting new geography. That explanation is reasonable. Once a valley becomes a lake, the map must change. But the question remains, why were some historical details excluded rather than preserved in supplemental documentation? Why were entire settlement patterns condensed into a single label reading submerged area? There is also the matter of materials. Geological surveys conducted during dam construction identified large deposits of high-density limestone within the Ozark Hills. This stone is unusually durable, resistant to erosion, and capable of supporting massive loads. It is the same material used in many of the region's older masonry structures. Engineers noted its strength repeatedly in project reports. They relied on it to anchor dam foundations and stabilize spillways. Yet, in several cases, excavation teams encountered stone blocks already cut and positioned within natural formations, as if earlier builders had exploited the same geological advantages. These blocks displayed flat surfaces and right angles inconsistent with natural fracturing. Workers recorded the findings briefly, then continued blasting operations. The stone remembers. Another detail emerges from property records and legal filings associated with reservoir development. When federal agencies acquired land for flooding, they were required to inventory structures located on each parcel. Houses, barns, and fences were listed meticulously. Compensation depended on accurate documentation. But in a number of counties, inventories contain vague references to stone improvements or subsurface features without detailed description. The entries are short, sometimes only a single line, yet they appear frequently enough to form a recognizable pattern. What matters is not the wording itself. What matters is the repetition. A fair assessment must acknowledge that large engineering projects often encounter unexpected features. Natural rock formations can resemble artificial structures. Erosion can create geometric shapes. Historical records can be incomplete or inconsistent. The mainstream explanation argues that the anomalies documented in the Ozark valleys reflect normal geological variation and the limitations of early surveying technology. That argument carries weight. It aligns with established scientific principles and decades of field observation, but it does not explain the uniformity of certain measurements. It does not explain the systematic removal of specific details from later records, and it does not explain why so many unusual features were documented briefly, then left unexamined. Scale is the next consideration. When researchers began comparing reservoir construction timelines across multiple states, they noticed clusters of projects initiated within remarkably short intervals. Between 1925 and 1945, dozens of major dams were approved, funded, and completed in rapid succession. The official narrative describes this surge as a response to economic crisis and the need for public works employment. That explanation is credible. Yet the concentration of activity also created conditions in which large areas of land could be transformed quickly, often with limited oversight. Valleys were cleared, structures were demolished, terrain was reshaped, water levels rose. Once submerged, the landscape became inaccessible to routine inspection. The evidence, whatever its origin, remained preserved but hidden beneath the surface. There is another factor rarely discussed in public histories: classification. During the early 20th century, federal agencies maintained strict control over engineering data related to strategic infrastructure. Detailed maps, geological analyses, and construction reports were often restricted for security reasons. Hydroelectric dams were considered critical assets. Information about their design and surrounding terrain could be sensitive. In some cases, documents remained classified for decades. This does not imply deliberate secrecy about ancient structures or unknown civilizations. It suggests a bureaucratic environment in which information was compartmentalized, archived, and forgotten as personnel changed and priorities shifted. Economics played a role as well. Large reservoirs generated revenue through electricity sales, irrigation support, and recreational development. Once the dams were operational, local governments and private investors had strong incentives to promote the projects as unqualified successes. Emphasizing unresolved anomalies or unexplained features would have complicated that narrative. It would have raised questions about liability, environmental impact, and historical preservation. Inertia is powerful. Institutions tend to maintain established explanations rather than reopen settled cases. Satellite imaging in recent decades has added a modern perspective to the investigation. High-resolution sonar and remote sensing technologies allow researchers to map submerged terrain with remarkable precision. Surveys conducted during periods of low water have revealed linear ridges, stepped platforms, and symmetrical depressions along reservoir bottoms. These formations appear in multiple locations, often aligned with features documented in early survey maps. The official interpretation describes them as remnants of pre-flood infrastructure or natural geological formations shaped by erosion. That explanation is plausible, but the consistency of the patterns and their recurrence across separate reservoirs invites closer scrutiny. Consider the dimensions. Several submerged formations measure between 60 and 100 feet across, with edges forming near-perfect right angles. Their surfaces remain stable despite decades of sediment accumulation and water movement. In engineering terms, structures of that scale require deliberate planning and skilled construction. They do not emerge casually from random processes. The question is not whether such formations exist. The record shows that they do. Another revealing detail lies in transportation infrastructure built during dam construction. Rail lines were extended into remote valleys to deliver cement, steel, and heavy equipment. Temporary bridges and tunnels were erected to support the work. After the reservoirs were completed, many of these installations were dismantled, leaving minimal trace on modern maps. Yet, photographs taken during construction show extensive networks of tracks and platforms, reaching deep into areas now covered by water. Why invest in such elaborate logistics for terrain described as sparsely populated farmland? The official explanation emphasizes efficiency and scale. Large projects require large infrastructure. That reasoning is sound. But the photographs reveal more than logistical necessity. They reveal a landscape already shaped by previous construction, one that demanded careful navigation rather than simple clearance. What remains is the alignment. Archaeological surveys conducted along exposed reservoir margins during drought years have uncovered fragments of pottery, metal tools, and carved stone objects dating back centuries. These discoveries confirm that human activity in the Ozark region extends far beyond the 19th century. Indigenous communities inhabited the valleys for generations before European settlement. Their engineering knowledge included earthworks, terraces, and complex trade networks. This historical context is essential. It reminds us that sophisticated construction did not begin with modern industry. It evolved gradually, adapted to local materials, and left physical traces embedded in the landscape. Yet, even this explanation leaves certain measurements unresolved. Some submerged formations exceed the scale associated with known indigenous structures. Others display masonry techniques inconsistent with documented regional traditions. The discrepancy is subtle but persistent. The pattern repeats. By the late 20th century, recreational boating and tourism had transformed the reservoirs into popular destinations. Shorelines were developed with marinas, vacation homes, and commercial facilities. The water became part of daily life, a symbol of prosperity and progress. Few residents considered what lay beneath the surface. The past had been replaced by leisure. But during severe drought conditions, the water receded dramatically, exposing fragments of the old valleys once again. Stone walls emerged along muddy banks, foundations appeared in shallow coves, rusted machinery surfaced from sediment. Photographs circulated briefly in local newspapers, then faded from public memory as rainfall returned and water levels rose. The stone remembers. What changed over time was not the landscape itself. What changed was the explanation. The official narrative of the Ozark reservoirs remains grounded in practical engineering and economic necessity. Flood control, electricity generation, and regional development were genuine priorities. The dams accomplished those goals. They reduced seasonal disasters and supported industrial growth. The benefits are measurable and widely acknowledged, but the record also contains anomalies that resist simple classification. Structures documented briefly, then submerged. Measurements recorded precisely, then omitted from later summaries. Patterns repeated across multiple valleys and states. These details do not demand sensational conclusions. They demand careful investigation. There is no need to imagine secret societies or dramatic conspiracies. Large institutions rarely operate through hidden plots. More often, they rely on routine decisions made under pressure, guided by budgets, deadlines, and political expectations. When unexpected features appear during construction, the priority is to complete the project, not to rewrite history. Files are archived, reports are condensed, questions are postponed. Over time, postponed questions become forgotten questions. Today, the reservoirs of the Ozark region appear permanent and natural, their shorelines lined with docks and summer cabins. The water reflects sunlight, calm and familiar. Visitors see recreation, not excavation. They see scenery, not sediment. But beneath that surface lies a preserved landscape, sealed in darkness and pressure, unchanged except for the weight of water above it. Roads remain where they were built. Foundations remain where they were laid. Stone formations remain where they were measured. The record is still there. The unsettling possibility is not that something extraordinary was hidden deliberately. It is that something significant was encountered, documented briefly, and then set aside because acknowledging it would have complicated the project. Flooding a valley solves many problems at once. It stabilizes unstable terrain. It eliminates maintenance costs, and it removes inconvenient questions from immediate view. The Ozark reservoirs stand today as monuments to engineering achievement.